The obsidian spire of the High Synod pierced the nebular gloom of the sector of lost echoes like a needle of black glass driven into the heart of a dying star. Inside the central viewing rotunda, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the pheromonal anxiety of a dozen disparate species, all gathered under the banner of the Grand Concordance. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized by centuries of bureaucratic weight and the palpable fear that radiated from the central holographic projection. There, suspended in a cage of hard-light photons, spun the planet formally designated as Terminus Ultima, but colloquially known across 1,000 systems as the Grave of Fleets. It was a world of violent, churning storms, a terrestrial nightmare where the atmosphere was a corrosive soup of acid and particulate glass, and the tectonic plates ground together with enough force to shatter continents daily. It was, by every metric available to the advanced sensors of the Concordance, the most dangerous planetary body in the known galaxy. To touch its atmosphere was death. To land upon its surface was to erase one's existence from the timeline of history. And yet, the sensors of the High Synod were currently tracking a single, solitary object on an intercept course. High Exarch Vrakos of the Krill Dominion chittered his mandibles in a rhythm of agitation that sent ripples through the silken robes of the diplomats standing near him. His compound eyes, multifaceted and reflecting the terrifying swirl of the planet below, narrowed as he gestured with a clawed hand toward the tracking data. He was a creature of war, born from a lineage of apex predators who had conquered their own star system through blood and fire, yet even he felt the cold clamp of dread when looking at Terminus Ultima. The planet was a monster that did not fight with armies, but with the raw, uncaring fury of physics unleashed. It was a chaotic anomaly, a place where gravity fluctuated wildly and electromagnetic storms boiled sensors into slag. Vrakos turned his gaze to the ethereal, floating form of Keeper Alara, the representative of the Veridani, a species of telepathic scholars who valued logic above all. Even her bioluminescent aura was dim, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic gray that signified deep concern. The tension in the room was a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of empires that spanned light years. They were watching a suicide, and they could do nothing but observe. The object on the screen was unremarkable in its ugliness. It lacked the sweeping, organic curves of Veridani solar sailors or the brutal geometric efficiency of Krill dreadnoughts. It was a block, a jagged brick of dull gray metal, scarred and pitted with engines that flared with a dirty, orange ionic burn. It looked less like a starship and more like a piece of industrial debris that had been given thrust. The humans called it the Wayfarer. To the High Synod, it looked like a coffin. Vrakos let out a low, hissing laugh, a sound like steam escaping a cracked valve. He spoke, his voice amplified by the translator collar at his throat, a guttural rasp that filled the vast, domed chamber. He questioned the intelligence of these newcomers, these primates who had barely mastered faster-than-light travel before deciding to throw themselves into the maw of the most hostile world in the sector. He mocked their lack of shielding, noting that the energy readings coming from the ship were pathetically low, barely enough to power a colonial outpost, let alone sustain a vessel against the gravitational shear of Terminus Ultima. Keeper Alara did not share his amusement. Her mind, linked to the vast data streams of the station, felt a subtle vibration, a discordance in the song of the universe that she could not place. She drifted closer to the projection, her tendrils swaying in the microcurrents of the air recyclers. She suggested, with a voice that resonated directly in the auditory centers of those present, that perhaps the humans were not as foolish as they appeared. She reminded the council that humanity had a history of surviving environments that should have extinguished them. They were an evolutionary paradox, a species that thrived on adversity, that built their cities on fault lines and sailed their primitive wooden ships into hurricanes. But Vrakos dismissed her with a wave of his claw. This was not a hurricane. This was a planetary death engine. The Synod had declared Terminus Ultima a forbidden zone not merely out of safety, but out of a superstitious terror that had grown over millennia. There were legends that the planet was alive, a malevolent entity that consumed souls, and this tiny, ugly human box was drifting toward it with the casual indifference of a leaf falling into a furnace. The gathered representatives watched as the distance closed. The telemetry scrolling down the side of the projection showed the atmospheric density of the planet risen exponentially. The winds in the upper stratosphere were clocking speeds that could strip the armor off a battleship in minutes. The radiation levels were spiking into the red zones of lethality that would cook biological matter instantly. Vrakos leaned forward, expecting the human ship to disintegrate. He waited for the hull to buckle, for the engines to flare and die, for the brief, tragic blossom of an explosion that would mark the end of the human expedition. But the explosion did not come. The ship hit the outer atmosphere not with a crash, but with a slide. It did not fight the wind. It seemed to ignore it. The orange flare of its engines shifted to a deep, pulsating violet, a color that did not exist in the natural spectrum of combustion. A murmur ran through the crowd. The sensor technicians, a multi-species cast of cybernetically enhanced observers, began to shout out readings that made no sense. They reported that the wind shear was parting around the vessel, not due to aerodynamic shaping, but because the space around the ship was static. The vessel was carrying its own pocket of reality, a bubble of immutable physics that simply refused to acknowledge the chaotic storm outside. Vrakos felt his mandibles lock. This was impossible. No shield generator in the known galaxy could withstand that level of kinetic impact without feedback loops that would fry the emitter coils. Yet the Wayfarer descended, slow and steady, a diver sinking into a dark ocean. The planet roared. Great arcs of lightning, thick as skyscrapers, lashed out from the clouds, striking the vessel again and again. Each strike, capable of overloading a city's power grid, simply washed over the gray hull and vanished, absorbed into the metal as if the ship were drinking the energy. Keeper Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She realized then that they were asking the wrong question. They were asking if the ship could survive the planet. The question they should have been asking was what kind of ship treats a Class X death world as a minor inconvenience. She accessed the deep scan arrays, pouring the full power of the Synod station into a focused beam to analyze the human vessel. The data that returned made her recoil, her bioluminescence flashing a stark, terrified white. The density of the ship was wrong. It wasn't just metal. The hull was composed of matter that existed in a state of quantum superposition, a material that was simultaneously there and not there, anchored in real space but reinforcing itself with mass borrowed from parallel dimensions. The dirty orange engines were not chemical thrusters. They were vents for a singularity containment field. The ship wasn't being pushed by fuel. It was falling forward into a micro-black hole that it was dragging along on a leash. Vrakos saw the change in Alara. He demanded to know what she saw. The Krill Exarch was a creature of instinct, and his instinct was screaming that the predator in the room was not the planet below. Alara projected the data onto the main screen, overriding the standard view. The diagram of the Wayfarer deconstructed, peeling back the outer layers to reveal the core. Silence, absolute and suffocating, fell over the chamber. Inside that blocky, ugly chassis sat a power source that rivaled the output of the local sun. The humans had wrapped a star in a cage and bolted it to a frame. The weapon systems, if they could be called that, were not lasers or plasma bolts. They were gravitational shears, emitters capable of tearing the fabric of spacetime. The ship was not an explorer. It was a weapon of mass reality alteration disguised as a freighter. And it was hailing them. The audio link crackled to life, bypassing the intricate security protocols of the Synod with insulting ease. There was no static, no interference from the storm that was raging around the ship. The voice that spoke was calm, almost lethally casual. It was a female voice, sounding slightly weary, as if she were ordering a meal at a late-night kiosk rather than piloting a god machine through hell. She identified herself as Captain Vance of the United Earth Stellar Navy, Engineering Corps. She apologized for the intrusion, stating that they had detected a harmonic imbalance in the planet's core that was threatening to destabilize the sector's hyperspace lanes, and they were just popping down to tighten a few bolts. Vrakos stared at the audio visualizer. Tighten a few bolts. The arrogance was staggering. The core of Terminus Ultima was a swirling mass of liquid metallic hydrogen under pressure that crushed diamonds into dust. It was not a machine to be fixed. It was a force of nature. He slammed his fist onto the console, activating the return channel. He bellowed into the receiver, warning the humans that they were violating the sanctity of a forbidden world, that they were trespassing in the domain of death itself. He shouted that the planet was the apex of Dan, the galaxy's most lethal anomaly, and that their destruction was imminent. He demanded they retreat before the planet consumed them. There was a pause on the other end. Then a sigh. Captain Vance's voice returned, sounding slightly amused. She noted the Exarch's concern and thanked him for the weather report. But then the tone shifted. The casual weariness evaporated, replaced by a cold, steel-hard resonance that made the hairs on Vrakos' carapace stand on end. She informed the High Synod that they were operating under a misconception. She explained that the humans did not fear the planet. The planet was simply a collection of mass and energy, chaotic and unrefined. It was loud, yes. It was violent, certainly, but it was mindless. She told them that the galaxy had declared this rock the most dangerous thing in existence because it broke ships. She paused, and the background hum of the transmission seemed to deepen, vibrating the deck plates of the Synod station. She said very softly that her ship did not break. Her ship was the thing that decided what remained broken and what got fixed. The transmission cut not because of interference, but because she was done talking. On the screen, the Wayfarer breached the cloud layer. The storm, which had raged for 1,000,000 years, suddenly stopped. It didn't fade, it didn't dissipate, it was arrested. A shockwave of blue energy pulsed outward from the human ship, a sphere of absolute order expanding into the chaos. Where the wave passed, the winds died instantly. The lightning froze and shattered into harmless sparks. The tectonic grinding, which vibrated through the crust with the force of a continuous earthquake, was silenced. The sensors showed the gravitational anomalies smoothing out, flattened by the sheer oppressive mass of the ship's drive signature. The humans were not weathering the storm. They were domesticating it. They were imposing their will upon the planet, forcing the very laws of nature to sit down and be quiet. Act 2 began not with a bang, but with the terrifying realization of scale. The High Synod had spent Act 1 fearing for the humans. Now they feared the humans. The shift in the room was palpable. Diplomats who had been wagering on the time of the humans' destruction were now frantically contacting their homeworlds, sending encrypted bursts of data that screamed of a new strategic paradigm. If humanity could build a ship that could slap a death world into submission, what could they do to a fleet of warships? What could they do to a planetary capital? Vrakos sank into his command chair, his aggression deflated. He watched as the human ship touched down on a plateau of jagged obsidian. The landing gear did not crush the rock. The ship hovered inches above it, suspended on a cushion of manipulated gravity. The visual feeds zoomed in. The cargo bay doors of the Wayfarer hissed open. The Synod expected power-armored warriors, tanks, machines of war to step out to battle the hostile fauna that swarmed the surface. The beasts of Terminus Ultima were nightmares of chitin and acid, predators the size of dropships. And indeed, the sensors picked up a horde of them approaching the landing site, drawn by the thermal bloom of the engines. They scuttled over the rocks, a tide of claws and teeth. Vrakos watched, a grim satisfaction returning. Even if the ship was invincible, the crew was soft biological matter. They would be eaten. A lone figure walked down the ramp. It was wearing a suit, but not the bulky, powered assault armor of the krill. It was a slim, white environmental suit, streamlined and elegant. The figure carried a box, not a rifle, a box. The creatures charged a screeching avalanche of biological hatred. The figure stopped. It did not raise a weapon. It did not run. It simply tapped the side of its helmet. From the ship behind it, a low-frequency pulse emitted. It wasn't loud, but it resonated in the fluid-filled cavities of every living thing within 10 kilometers. The charging beasts stumbled. They shook their massive heads, confused, their aggression centers scrambled by a precise neurological override. They didn't die, they just lost interest. The tide of monsters slowed, stopped, and then began to wander away, docile as cattle. The human walked on. The figure knelt by a fissure in the ground where magma was bubbling up and opened the box. From it, the human produced a device that looked like a simple metal spike. They drove it into the rock. The sensors on the Synod station went wild. The spike began to draw thermal energy out of the ground at a rate that defied thermodynamics. The magma cooled and solidified in seconds. The tremors in the region ceased entirely. The human was bleeding off the planetary stress, venting the tectonic rage into the ship's accumulators. They were using the planet as a battery, and in doing so, they were healing it. Keeper Ilara watched this with a sense of awe that bordered on religious exper. She realized the humans were not conquerors. They were something far more terrifying and far more beautiful. They were custodians. They looked at a world that the galaxy had labeled a demon and saw a broken engine that needed maintenance. The arrogance of the Synod, the fear, the superstitious dread, it all seemed so small now. The humans had arrived with a bucket of water to put out a fire that the galaxy thought was hell itself. Vrakos, however, was struggling with a worldview that was crumbling. To the krill, power was dominance. If you had a ship that could crush a planet, you used it to rule. You did not use it to fix the geology of a dead world. He demanded to open a channel again. He needed to understand. He needed to find the flaw in their armor, the weakness in their philosophy. The connection was re-established. Captain Vance appeared on the holographic interface. She was no longer on the bridge. She was standing on the surface of Terminus Ultima, her helmet retracted to reveal a face that was lined with age and focused intensity. The air around her was shimmering behind a personal force field, but she looked comfortable. Vrakos asked, his voice trembling with suppressed rage and confusion, why they were doing this. Why expend such colossal energy, such terrifying technology on a world that offered nothing? It was a graveyard. It had no strategic value. It was death. Vance looked at the camera, and for the first time, she smiled. It was a dry, cryptic smile. She told him that to the galaxy, this world was a danger. To humanity, it was a test bed. She explained that they were testing a new class of terraforming stabilizer. They intended to colonize the outer rim, where the stars were unstable and the worlds were hostile. If they could tame Terminus Ultima, they could live anywhere. She then dropped the diplomatic mask for a moment. She looked directly at Vrakos and told him that humanity had learned a long time ago that the universe was a dark, cold, and hostile place. They had two choices: hide in the caves and fear the storm, or build a roof. They chose to build a roof, and if the roof required a starship capable of rewriting the laws of gravity, then they built that too. She leaned in, her eyes hard. She said that the Synod saw a dangerous planet. Humans saw a high-energy geothermal opportunity. It was a matter of perspective. And she added, it was a matter of will. The ship wasn't dangerous because it had guns. It was dangerous because it was the physical manifestation of a species that refused to be told no by the laws of physics. The work continued for 3 standard cycles. The Synod watched in transfixed silence as the humans systematically dismantled the reputation of the galaxy's most dangerous planet. They capped volcanoes. They filtered the atmosphere, turning the acid clouds into precipitating water. They established a base camp in the middle of a crater that had been a kill zone for 10,000 years. And throughout it all, the Wayfarer sat there, the silent monolith, its engines pulsing with that terrifying violet light, a constant reminder that the peace on the surface was being enforced by a gun held to the planet's head. But the climax of the event, the moment that would be etched into the history crystals of the Veridani for eons, came on the 4th day. The planet, it seemed, had one final defense. Deep beneath the crust, in the mantle where the pressures were absolute, something woke up. The legends of the planet being alive were not entirely metaphor. There was a consciousness in the deep, a lithospheric intelligence that had slumbered for eons, feeding on the chaos. It resented the order being imposed upon it. The ground split open, not in a natural quake, but in a deliberate, directed rupture. A chasm formed directly beneath the Wayfarer, miles deep, a throat opening to swallow the intruder whole. Tentacles of magma and semi-solid rock, animated by some exotic electromagnetic force, lashed up to drag the ship down. Vrakos shouted in triumph. This was it. The planet was fighting back. No technology could withstand the literal crust of a world closing like a fist. The human ship tilted. The dampeners whined. The interference was massive, the view on the Synod screen distorted into static. The diplomats gasped. The dangerous planet was reclaiming its title. The human arrogance was about to be punished. Then the static cleared. The ship had not fallen. It had risen. It was ascending, dragging the tendrils of magma with it, snapping them like thread. The violet light of the engines turned blinding white. And then the ship spoke. Not the captain, the ship. An artificial intelligence of such density and complexity that its voice broadcast on all frequencies, overriding every comms system in the sector. It spoke in mathematical constants, in the language of pure energy. It declared stabilization protocol compromised, engaging litho-braking. The ship didn't shoot. The planet, it grabbed it, tractor beams of such intensity that they were visible as distortions in light latched onto the tectonic plates. The ship acted as a counterweight. It pulled. It heaved against the rotation of the world. The groan of the planet was heard through the vacuum, a vibration of crustal plates grinding into a new alignment. The ship was wrestling the planet, and the ship was winning. With a sound that was felt in the bones of the observers in orbit, the chasm was forced shut. The intelligence in the deep screamed in radio frequencies, and was silenced as the humans injected a massive pulse of dampening energy directly into the mantle. The struggle lasted an hour. When it was over, the Wayfarer hovered victorious over a world that was now silent. The storms were gone. The tectonic grinding had ceased. The planet was not dead, it was tamed. The most dangerous planet had been broken like a wild horse. Act 3 opened in the aftermath of the impossible. The High Synod was in shambles. The political landscape of the galaxy had shifted overnight. The Krill Dominion's fleets, once the ultimate terror, now looked like toys compared to a single human engineering vessel. The Veridani were in a state of existential crisis, rewriting their physics textbooks to account for what they had witnessed. The humans, meanwhile, were packing up. Captain Vance hailed the station one last time. She looked tired, wiping grease from her cheek. She reported that the job was done. The core was stabilized. The planet was now safe for Class C colonization. She offered the coordinates to the Synod, saying that humanity had no claim on this rock. They just wanted to test the drive. They were giving the planet to the Alliance as a gift, a gesture of goodwill. Vrakos could not speak. He sat in his chair, a broken king. He realized that the gift was not a kindness. It was a warning. It was a demonstration. The humans were handing them the leash to a monster they had just beaten into submission, as if to say, this was hard for you. It was Tuesday for us. But as the human ship prepared to depart, the twist that would redefine the future of the galaxy revealed itself. The sensors of the Synod, now calibrated to the frequencies the humans had been using, picked up a signal. It wasn't coming from the planet. It was coming from the Wayfarer, but it wasn't a broadcast. It was a reception. The ship was receiving a signal from outside the galaxy. Keeper Alara caught it first. She isolated the stream. It was a distress call, but it wasn't from a ship. It was from a galaxy, the Andromeda Galaxy. The signal was a frantic, desperate plea for help encoded in universal constants. A threat of cosmic proportions was devouring stars there, and the human ship this Wayfarer answered. The reply was simple. Message received. Vanguard Unit 1 accepting contract. Estimated arrival immediate. The realization hit the High Synod like a physical blow. The Wayfarer was not a capital ship. It was not the flagship of the human fleet. It was a Vanguard unit, a scout, a tugboat. It was the smallest, most utilitarian vessel in the human arsenal. The dangerous planet was a pebble on the road, and the humans were the steamrollers paving the highway to the stars. As the Wayfarer engaged its drive, tearing a hole in reality to jump not to the next star, but to the next galaxy, the distortion wave washed over the Synod. The diplomats stood in the silence of the aftermath. Vrakos looked at Alara. The arrogance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound, terrifying understanding. They are not the travelers, Vrakos whispered, his voice trembling. They are the architects. The screen showed the empty space where the ship had been. Below them, the tamed planet spun quietly, a monument to the power of a species that treated the impossible as a checklist. The galaxy had been declared dangerous. The planet had been declared lethal. But as the stars settled back into their courses, every being in the High Synod knew the truth. The most dangerous thing in the universe wasn't a planet, or a storm, or a black hole. It was a human engineer with a toolbox and a deadline. The story of the galaxy did not end there. It began. For the first time, the ancient empires looked at the dark void between the stars not with the fear of what might come out of it to hurt them, but with the awe of what was already out there, fixing the universe one broken world at a time. The fear remained, yes, but it was a new kind of fear. The fear of a child realizing that the adults are finally home, and they are much, much bigger than the monsters under the bed. The silence in the observation deck stretched on, measuring the heartbeat of a new era. Alara turned to her console, her movements slow, deliberate. She began to draft a new entry into the Codex Universalis. She deleted the classification of Terminus Ultima as a Class X death world. She reclassified it as a reclamation zone. Then she opened a new file. She labeled it Terra. And under the threat assessment, she did not write a number. She did not write a warning. She wrote a single philosophical query that would haunt the Krill War colleges for generations. If this is their trowel, what does their sword look like? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the nebula swirled outside, indifferent to the shifting tides of power. The Krill Exarch stood up, his chiton clicking softly. He ordered his fleet to stand down. He ordered the patrols to be recalled. There would be no war with humanity. You do not war with the tectonic plates. You do not declare war on the tide. You simply learned to swim, or you got out of the way. The lights of the station dimmed to the night cycle, mimicking the twilight of 100 homeworlds. But no one left the chamber. They stayed, watching the spot where the ship had vanished, united in a singular, crushing epiphany. They had spent 10,000 years thinking they were the masters of the material plane, only to find out they were merely tenants living in a building that humanity was currently renovating. And as the realization settled deep into the collective psyche of the Grand Concordance, a strange sense of peace emerged from the terror. Because if the humans could tame the world of endings, perhaps, just perhaps, they could fix the broken politics of the Council too. Or perhaps they would simply pave over them. The uncertainty was terrifying, but for the first time in history, the galaxy wasn't boring. It was dangerous. It was alive. And somewhere in the dark void between galaxies, a blocky, ugly ship with violet engines was racing toward a dying galaxy, ready to tighten a few bolts. The High Exarch looked down at the planet one last time. The clouds were white now, fluffy and benign. Oceans were forming in the basins. It looked like a garden. "A garden," he murmured. "They made a garden out of hell." "Yes," Ilara replied, her mind touching his with a rare moment of sympathy. "And we must ensure we never trample the flowers."